Hey guys, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the philosophy, poetry, humanities teaching app. Go download it for your iPhone and Droid. Earlier today, Robert Schut taught me the third upbuilding discourse within the 4 upbuilding discourses of the 18 upbuilding courses of Soren Kierkegaard. We had this conversation via Google Hangout, and the audio was pretty much corrupted and unsalvageable on my end, so I took it upon myself to edit myself out of the entire conversation. Thankfully, it does not ruin the pace or the substance of anything Robert had said since he was leading the conversation. I'm going to work on that and get it better for you. I don't know what else I have to say. It was a really wonderful and enlightening lesson, and I am just such a lucky person to be gifted with a friend like Robert who can teach me Kierkegaard. I had to lean on him during the construction of some other seminars that I'm making for the Noetic app. So without further ado, I present Robert Schut's discussion of the third upbuilding discourse of the 4 upbuilding discourses.
Yeah, there's one comment on the teaching and the learning. What I found at teaching is I try to anticipate the class's questions, and that kind of gives me that little motivation to make sure that I don't get a question that I can't answer. So I try to anticipate all the questions that people in the class might answer, and so that makes me read the text a little differently than I would if I was just reading it to, as entertainment, or even to try to learn a little bit. When you try to read it anticipating questions, it gives me a little bit of a different way of understanding it. Maybe a little bit reading it a little bit more deeper than I normally would. Okay, so here we're doing the third discourse, and what's unusual is that he's using the same biblical verse from James 1:17, which is, all generous giving and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or the slightest hint of change. So we heard this through the last discourse, and we're going to hear it several times through this discourse. I think as Kierkegaard brings us back to this point over and over again, I noticed that as I was reading this, it seemed as though he was drifting off a little bit of the topic, but then he brought us back again by once again giving us this same biblical verse. So we'll see if we can kind of do that ourselves. In the last discussion that we had, we talked about man's acquisition of good and evil in the context of creation with Adam and Eve. So we had the story of Adam and Eve brought about the idea of what's good and evil. And then we talked a little bit more about what is the condition that makes a gift perfect. And it turned out that God is both the gift and the condition. And we kind of take it up from that point. Now, in this particular version, we're going to see how the gift becomes completed in love. And it takes Kierkegaard a little while to get to that conclusion, but he does eventually get to that conclusion. So he opens with the idea that God does not respect the status of persons. He's doing this in order to kind of showing how God levels the field, that everybody in the way of status, God considers the king and the pauper, the rich man and the poor man. He considers no class status here, simply because one person's wealthy or another person's poor. He doesn't see that the same way we do that, and that's going to, I think, play a big role in the dialogue that Kierkegaard will bring us through. But he gets this from the book of Acts, chapter 10:34, which says, "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, 'Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons.'" So this opinion of Kierkegaard's is biblically based in Acts 10:34. And then he goes on to say in these opening verses, that a man of faith should not spend his time looking for differences in the world, but rather spend it looking for the likeness of God. And this may not be the standard that we do, especially today. It seems like everybody wants to be different today. Nobody wants to resemble their parents or have the same ideas or the same clothes as the last generation. We all want to be different. And I think that explains a little bit of our social emphasis, and even, one might say, our obsession with being different. That may be based in our need for individuality or simply for individual attention. That I don't know for sure, and I'm sure there's a wide variety of answers to that. But Kierkegaard is trying to redirect that passion to be different into, instead of discovering differences in people, to find similarities and how things are similar to God. I think that goes back to what we were saying last week as to listening for God rather than trying to go out and find different things. The idea of listening for God is saying, I want to see you, Lord. I want to see what you're like, so show me what you're like. That, I think, may be what he's speaking about here, is by finding similarities to God. It's just kind of taking back and saying, okay, what can I hear that's different? Where can I find the being of God? And he's not, we're not judging people by looking for negatives about the individuals, but by seeking God wherever he might be leading us, as well as perhaps celebrating those likenesses that we find. So he's trying here to get us to start seeing things a little bit differently, our own context of not looking to see how is everybody else different, because that, I think, he sees in a negative sense that can easily turn into judgmentalism of other people, but rather focusing on seeing the glory of God rather than the differences of people. A lot of times we use those differences to, for the sake of argumentation or even exclusion. We find reasons to exclude people from our faith, reasons to exclude people from what we might consider to be acceptable. So we have to be careful. I think that's where he's focusing. Our familiarity with God by itself, I think, brings out the differences that we need to find. So the way I take those verses that he gives us is that we don't need to go out and look for differences. By looking for God's qualities and God's, what would we say, his glory, that will, in a sense, bring out the differences that we need to see. So we don't need to go out and do that on our own. And if we do it on our own, it may have some terrible results. So we want to focus on finding the similarities of God in other people, as well as in our circumstances. And he goes on a little bit more to talk about differences. We can't ignore the fact that there are differences. You know, if we said that, I think we'd be putting our heads in the sand and saying everybody is exactly the same. And we're not everybody is exactly the same. There are differences. But we don't want to see those differences as a means to elevate our own status. Do we see the superficial things in other people? Do we see financial and social position as the places that we place our value? So do we hold people high, the executives, higher in our sense of esteem than we do the common laborer? So we want to be careful not to let those positions of status influence us, and as far as how we see people. If we can't look beyond the criteria those superficial criteria in people, we might not be able to find them in God either. So we have to be looking with the right attitude towards God, or else we're going to find out applying those same things to God that we try to apply to other people as well. Now, the next thing he brings about in on page 142, and I'll read that here. He says, "But in the hallowed place, the voice of the ruler is heard no more than in the grave. There is no difference between man and woman, no more than in the resurrection. The presumptuous demands of wisdom are not heard there, and the pomp and the glory of the world are not seen there." So he's pointing us to this term, the hallowed place, and he never defines it. He never really tells us what is the hallowed place. So I had to try to figure out how would I interpret that. And I think the most direct interpretation is that we're in a prayerful state with God, the hallowed state, where we are in the very presence of God. Now, the term hallowed actually means a holy state, where we become in a holy state. And that led me to an idea that I try to teach in my class, which goes completely against a lot of other teachings, is that we in the New Testament, believers, are not called sinners. We're called the holy ones. Paul references us all the time as the holy ones. He never calls us, okay, we're the Christians, we're the sinners. And from my childhood, I was always taught that I was a sinner, whether I was a believer or not a believer. And so both me and my friends took on that persona quite easily. It was like, okay, well, if I'm called a sinner, then I guess I might as well live up to the reputation. And that became the norm. But what's that?
Sin all the more, right?
Yeah, I figured, well, if I'm a sinner, then what's the problem? I'm just living up to the reputation. But Paul, on the other hand, does not call us sinners, and he does not want us to act like sinners, but to act like God's holy, chosen people. So he calls us the holy ones of God. And this, I think, a lot of times makes people very uncomfortable. They're not used to being called the holy ones of God. It causes us to make a shift, a paradigm shift, as far as how we see ourselves and our relationship with both sin and with God. And what Kierkegaard calls Christendom has kind of enslaved us with this term of being a sinner. It stunted our spiritual growth, I think, simply because it's taken away our motivation to see ourselves as anything better than sinners. So we see ourselves in that category of sinners, and there's no desire to go beyond that. But that's not really the biblical way of seeing Christians. The biblical way is called the hagioi in Greek, or the holy ones. And this is Paul's theology. It's not necessarily mine. This is where I got it from. This is how Paul addresses us. So that's how I teach it in my own Bible study. I don't let people call themselves sinners or resort to that. Well, I'm only a sinner. No, you're not a sinner. You're a holy one of God, so act like a holy one of God. It's not that sin isn't still there waiting to jump into the game. It is. And so we're always conscious of that sinfulness in our flesh. But what Paul, I think, is trying to do here, and I'll say Kierkegaard as well, is to say, don't let that be an anchor to hold you back. You got to break free of those old terms, of, oh, I'm a sinner, and never going to be any better. And he says, no, stop thinking like that. You need to break away from that and see your life in faith, live your life in faith, because that's what's going to draw you to God. You've got to let God draw you. And sin is an anchor that holds us back. So the more we become convinced that we're just, sinners, the less we're going to be able to be drawn to God. And that's how I find that it works. It doesn't make people feel self-righteous, because we always, as you said, we always have to maintain the idea that we do have a sinful nature. And I know that every day I'm tempted. And so I can never forget that. But I won't let that drag me back. I'm not going to let that be my anchor. I'm going to let myself be drawn more to God, to enter into the infinite. I guess Kierkegaard might say, or enter into the eternal. You can't get into the eternal as long as you've got an anchor, dragging you down. So I've tried to put that. Yeah, I tried to put that anchor out of my life. I don't think of myself as a sinner in that sense anymore. Not that I think of myself as self-righteous, but I think of myself as a faithful person, and I don't have room to let sin drag me back down, because I've been there before. I've been in sin. I know what it's like to live in sin, and I don't want to go back to that point again. So I resist that temptation, because I know it can drag me back down very quickly and to very dark places, and I don't want to go to those places again. Yeah, hopelessness, and that sense of being lost and alone. That's where it brings you to that sense of. There's a word for it there, but I don't know what it is. I can't remember what it is. But yeah, it's that total sense of loss, that depravity. I don't need to go back there again. Then he gives us a little bit more now on equality, and that's where we started out, that God sees us all as being equal, at least in status. So in page 142, he gives us a couple more quotations, and I'll read these two back to back here. When the person who possesses the world is like one who does not possess it, and the person who does not possess the world is like one who does not create. And he gives us that sense of equality, where we're not out to possess the world, and we don't have that craving. Another person doesn't have the craving to possess the world. That brings a sense of equality. And then he says a little further down on the same page, no person is so exalted in rank that he is not your neighbor. In exactly the same sense as no person is so inferior in rank or so wretched that he is not your neighbor. And the equality is incontrovertibly demonstrated by your love of yourself. So he gives us a little idea of the golden rule there, is that we have to find that place of equalization where we can love our brother, or we can love another individual, not necessarily our brother, but our neighbor, whether he's wealthy or whether he's poor. Some people have a problem loving wealthy people just as much as others have a problem loving poor people. We might think the wealthy is high and mighty, and they've got a whole different lifestyle, and maybe we're jealous of them or envy them. And then we might have another feeling about poor people, that we don't really want to get too close to the poor people, so that the poverty might rub off, or maybe our guilt in having some wealth might make us feel guilty about it. So there's all sorts of different ways that we can see others, but we're encouraged, and Kierkegaard's going to spend a little bit more time here about equality. We must see our neighbor as an equal, whether he is of superior or inferior status, rich and poor. The equality can only be brought about through divine love, which is loving others as we love ourselves. So we have to see other people as though they are ourselves. And sometimes people will throw this comment back to me and say, so what you're saying is first I have to love myself before I can love other people. That's not what Jesus was saying, because too many people are spending so much time trying to love themselves that they forget about their neighbor. What he's saying is that we have to achieve that sense of equalization, that we can't see our neighbor either above us or below us. We have to see our neighbor at the same level of equality. That's what he's trying to get at there. Then he goes into a couple of terms that really puzzled me here. He talks about it being a war of aggression or a war of defense. and he really had me going with this for a while. The war of aggression I took as to mean we see those faults, the faults, as something that kind of externally attacks us to try to conform us into inequality, to see other people more in a prejudiced state. A fight that is against those outside forces that try to bring us into worldly favoritism. So there's external forces maybe that try to prejudice us to see other people's differences in negative ways. And then the war of defense is we see those faults as something from which we must protect ourselves from being drawn into perdition or hell. Protecting ourselves, in other words, from the kind of sin that might attack our very salvation. So it's kind of war of defending our sense of faith and salvation. Presume to help the whole world to obtain external equality, which is of very little benefit. All the less so because it never existed. For if no other reason than that everyone would come to thank him and become unequal before him. This is an important issue. I think it's an important issue in Christianity and in the church today. This is both an internal as well as an external battle. We cannot presume to help the whole world to achieve this sense of equality that Kierkegaard is talking about here. I admit that I don't know if I'm adding to this a little bit of my own opinion here, but if that's true, well, so be it. But Christians, the goal of Christianity is not to bring divine equality to the world as such. It's not to make everybody equal. The goal of Christianity, according to the New Testament anyway, is to spread the gospel and let the gospel create that equality in the world when and where it happens. This, I think, is more, this sense of equality, I think, is more the goal of philosophers and humanitarians. That's perfectly fine. That's how they see themselves fulfilling their calling. But this is not the direct goal of Christians. This is more of a result of spreading the gospel rather than a cause of it. So I'm speaking more of a goal that has, in many places, become a distraction to the gospel. People feel more comfortable in lending a helping hand, but really don't draw that connection between that helping hand and the gospel. World, I think we need to really focus as an individual as to say, I need to model that in my community. When people see me, they need to know I see everybody as equal as possible. And I'm a man who loves everybody equally. I love the rich. I love the poor. I love, all people as far equally as I possibly can. I think that is the best message to send out. Forcing people to be equal is a political thing that may work in communities and it may have positive benefits. But I think in my search for the right church and the right pastor and the right Bible study teacher, what I found lacking is the model. And I think that's where we as a church, and being self-critical and about myself and about churches, is that we need to model what we're saying, not just force the world to change. And so that's what I've made my life's work is to be the model, be the person that people are going to point at and say he's either a hypocrite or he's a model. He's a good man or he's a phony. So I lay myself out in the front for that. Somebody has to be a model. And they have to model what it's like to be a model, because I think the world has forgotten what it's like to be a model. I think we're always looking somewhere else for the model, because that's what I was doing. And that's when it finally dawned on me, or you might say the Lord shook me by my nape of my neck, and he says, "You idiot, you are the model." I can live up to that, but that's what I think that good pastors and good teachers need to do, is to say, stop looking for the model, be the model. And then I think we'd see a lot of equality. The church would resemble what Christ looked like. We would be, as individuals and as a community, the Sermon on the Mount, which is what you were sharing with me, which you've read recently. Wouldn't it be nice if we all lived that life? And that's what we should try to do. That's what our goal should be.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
So then he gets back to genuine equality on page 143 as well. 142 and 43 is practically all yellow, all highlighted in my book here. Okay, so on the second part, it says, such a rash and worldly haste, which presumably even thinks that some external condition or other is the genuine equality, to which anything that stands higher must be brought down, to which anything that stands lower must be lifted up, and produces nothing but confusion and self-contradiction, as if it were true equality. Now, here, I guess I'm familiar with some of Kierkegaard's other ideas, so I took this to mean a kind of leveling, and in a pejorative sense. In other words, by forcing everybody who's higher down to a lower level, and by forcing everybody who's lower to a higher level, we will achieve genuine equality. But true equality isn't attained by actually making people the same, but it's by treating everyone as though they were the same. So it's a little different. I mean, what would we prove if we made everybody the same? You know, it's like those futuristic movies. Everybody wears the white uniform, and everybody talks the same. And is that really true equality? And Kierkegaard says, no. It's when you are able to treat those people who are higher as equals to those people who are lower, at least who appear to be, socially speaking. That's when we truly achieve that genuine equality. In the middle, we've got to rise above those differences and not look at them in a pejorative sense. We have to see that as a challenge for our faith. As again, can I be the model? Can I really love everybody equally? If I can't, well then, that means I need to get in touch with my faith a little bit more. Next, he goes on to external uniformity, once again on page 143. When, on the contrary, it seeks to kill everything in a spirit-consuming uniformity. And I think you already said that. I think,
Hey.
Yeah, you nailed that one right on the head there. Making everyone actually equal destroys the spirit of the words and eliminates the need for spiritual growth. Socialism and communism can't be a substitute for faithful Christian maturity. It's a challenge or a test of one's faith. It kind of lets us know how we're doing. To actually make everyone equal eliminates the need for that challenge. So it's like living in a world of utopia. Then how do we measure our faith? If there's no challenges in the world, then how do we know how we're doing? We don't. It becomes just, like you said, just one bland life that without emotion, without passion, certainly, and without. So see what possibly could happen there, because all those movies never ended very well for those societies. Okay, then it talks about the dividing or creating classes. We can identify ourselves in two separate classes he gives us. The class of givers and the class of receivers. So we might want to say, well, I like to be in the class of the givers because it makes me feel better about myself. I don't want to be one of those receivers. I'd rather be the giver. It puts me in a better light than the way people look at the guy who's begging or the guy who needs something, the needy person. So sometimes we might even reject a gift if it makes us look needy in front of other people. I've kind of seen that happen. People think they're too good to be a receiver of the gift. They only want to play the giver. So we might think that this places the other person maybe in a more prominent position over us. So if we receive something from somebody, our own prejudice might tell us that I'm giving him kind of like that one-upmanship over me. I'm making him superior to me by receiving the gift. But that's not where Kierkegaard is going to go with this. As a matter of fact, there is a quotation from Paul in 1 Corinthians in chapter 7, 21 and 22, where he knows there's a difference in social in his social world. He says, "Were you called while a slave? Don't be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman, and likewise he who is called while free is Christ's slave." So here Paul is giving us his own idea of how the Christian should see himself in this process. Don't let your physical status influence how you think about yourself. So he wants them to start thinking of themselves the way God does. In other words, love your neighbor as yourself. You have to see yourself not as the world labels you, but as God labels you. If God loves you, well, then you're worth being loved. And that's what Paul is trying to tell us here. And what he's also giving us here is what we might call the divine equality. Everybody's equal in God's eyes. The slave, I call the slave. I call the rich man. No, I call everybody that I love towards salvation. Then Kierkegaard brings us back again, which after we think that he's taken us off track a little bit here, then he comes back and he re-quotes the scripture about all generous giving and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variation or the slightest hint of change. So when we see...
By the way, I just want to point out how much I enjoy this passage from James and how God is referred to as the Father of lights. I had never heard that before.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure where he gets that from. James, being steeped in Judaism, is probably pulling this out of the Old Testament somewhere, although... there was a celebration down that I remember where lights was very important. I can't remember the name of it, but it was one that Jesus attended, where it has to do a lot with lighting up torches and I don't know if he was called the Father of Lights in there, but that whole idea is probably comes to James through his practice of Judaism. So I'll have to look at that, but it probably comes from somewhere in the Old Testament. I'll see where it is. I think what Kierkegaard is doing by re-quoting that to us again is to remind us of the perspective that we need to use in order to understand the gift, which now he's going to spend a little bit more time with talking about what is the gift and why is it a perfect gift again. Providence takes no care in the gift, he tells us, for it can very easily take the gift from us and give it to another. So he's telling us that our gifts are not our own. They're only temporary. So whatever wealth we have, whatever it is that we're giving away to someone else, whether it's money or he'll go into other types of gifts, but whether it's money or whatever, those are only given to us temporarily. We're custodians of it. We're not owners of it. And it could, as we know, life can very easily turn on us in a matter of moments, and the wealthy can become poor and the poor can become wealthy if you win the lottery, I guess. But it's possible. Life can just flip upside down on us. There is such a thing I don't think he uses the term false or pseudo equality, but there is kind of an equality that is not a true equality. A rich, and one that he uses as an example, that if a rich man invites another rich man to a banquet and hopes that he'll invite him back again, is kind of the quid pro quo or reciprocation. That's not equality. When you do something with the expectation the other person is going to give me back something of equal value, that's just kind of trading. That's not a sense of divine equality. If you, on the other hand, invited someone who couldn't possibly invite you back again, and then you were to demand from him some kind of remuneration or some kind of servitude from him, you're also acting in a sense of false equality. That's not equality. He likens that to the situation that Christ faced where Satan tempted Jesus by saying, look, he says, if you worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. That wasn't equality. That was a temptation. And so we have to see it in that sense. Then Kierkegaard, again, I'm not going to read it again, but he once again reminds us of the scripture in question. But then we go down to page 147. Take me a while to flip through my pages here. We go to 147. He says, every good and every perfect gift is indeed from above, and earthly treasures of such have no promises, no preeminent right to be called that. If then you are able to give for your own sake and for the sake of the other, never forget that it is from above. So he reminds us the source of all gifts. The source does not, even though it might appear to be very valuable in our world, in our customs, or in our, what do we call it, culture, we don't have a right to judge that gift according to the way culture does, because it's a perfect gift. It comes from God. So we can't base our system of value upon it. It's kind of like the woman's mites, if you remember that story, where the Pharisee gave a lot of money, but it was really a small token in regards to what he actually owned, as opposed to the widow who only had a penny. And she gives out 1 penny, which was everything to her. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the man who was very wealthy, who gave just a very little token amount. So we can't judge the gift from God in the same sense. Then he talks about something that seems strange here that I wanted to say a little bit more about, which is gifts that tempt. And he talks about that again on page 147. If you see that the needy one is being led into temptation, then come with the admonition, direct him to God, or preferably abstain entirely from giving to him. And all the prolixity of philanthropy that enables you to rejoice in your wealth, do not forget that it is better and more blessed and infinitely more important to save a soul. When this idea comes alive in your soul, it will humble you and your gift in fear and trembling. That is a very important verse. A lot of people, they kind of ask, well, how do you limit your giving? Do you give to the beggar in the street? Do you give to these societies? Do you give to these groups? I think we need to see that answer in the context of Kierkegaard here, telling us that some gifts have a caveat to them. What if our gift tempts another person? leads them into sin or supports a sinful lifestyle or a sinful habit. According to Kierkegaard, he tells us that we're to admonish that person and say, you need to get your life squared away with God. You know, I'll give you the gift, but you need to get your life squared away with God. Or we refrain from giving him the gift entirely. Our philanthropy should not override our sense of holiness, is what I get from that. He tells us that it's more important to focus on the man's soul. You're not just giving to make the person's life better. You're giving in order to give a gift from God, which would have that sense of holiness to it. So we're not there just to bring comfort to other people. We're there to remind them that there's a holy life that goes along with God. We need to bring them back to God. And again, that gets into what I was saying earlier. The Christian message is the gospel. That is the message. And good will come from that message, but we can't neglect the message for that feeling of philanthropy, to say, well, how nice of a person I am, I gave to this person. That kind of goes against Jesus's admonition to don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing, in a sense, which we're going to get into as well. So what we're saying is that we have a responsibility in the process of gift giving, and that is to not give gifts that would knowingly mislead, deceive, or encourage some kind of sinful or destructive behavior. So we do have to remember we do have some sort of a responsibility. So then how do we give a gift is the next idea. We give with an attitude of intermediacy. In other words, we don't take credit for the giving of the gift. The giver of the gift actually, in Kierkegaard's words, becomes insignificant. The left hand, in fact, doesn't know what the right hand is doing. If I give a gift, I am not significant. It's not that I need to remind this person, don't forget who gave you the gift now. It's I give you the gift and don't forget the gift, that the gift is from above, not from me. I'm just merely handing it to you, but the gift is from above and it's a perfect gift. So thank God for the gift. Don't thank me for the gift. So we're considered, well, let me go backtrack just a little bit. Does that, and when I first read those two pieces, I thought, well, does that create a conflict then? Do we then not have a conflict in our concern about sin? If the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, aren't we saying just give the gift and don't worry about it? But then Kierkegaard, previous to that, says, no, you have a responsibility to not give gifts that are going to lead people to sin. So I thought about that and I said, well, is that a conflict? How can you have both? And I thought, no, it's not a conflict, because it means we don't take credit for the gift, but we are still bound to a sense of responsibility. We're still tied into the idea that this gift is from God, not from me, but yet God wouldn't give you the serpent when you asked for a piece of fish. So I have to keep other ideas in my mind at the same time. We're considered ambassadors of God. So what we're doing to people, God is going to see, that's God doing to me. So they may not be able to see God visibly as God, but they see him through me as the gift giver. And he talks then about the judgment of the gift. It's a gift. If the gift is from God, then its value is in God's eyes, not in ours. And we become, as the gift givers, and as we'll find out, even as the gift receivers, we become less significant. Okay, page 149, he kind of tells us that. There we go. Yet, It is not only by means of external and earthly goods that one person can help another. He may also help him by means of guidance and advice, consolation and admonition and sympathy. So there's other ways, other gifts that we can give to people that are not necessarily of monetary value. It's not like we can see what these gifts are worth on the internet. Look them up on Amazon and say, "Oh, I know what the value is." How do you look up? What was one of the gifts? What I'm thinking of. How do you value sympathy? How do you put a money value on sympathy? You just can't do it. Sometimes we establish a contingency that will only give gifts if the one receiving it is weaker than we are. It's, again, that kind of one-upmanship. It's a sense of looking to feel good about ourselves, sometimes looking to feel superior to the other person. So we give the gift to the guy who's very needy, and we walk away, and our heart is pumping fast, that we feel like, okay, this is a wonderful gift, we've done something really great, and God is really going to reward me for it. But that's not what the gift is about. The gift is more important than the giving of the gift. And this comes out in sympathy. We then have to make ourselves less significant than the sympathy. The gift then becomes higher than we are. And he talks a little bit about here the idea that the gift must not originate in your own heart, but be there from above. In other words, we must not think too highly of ourselves and confuse human compassion for divine compassion, which is the agape love that we hear so much about. There is a difference. And this takes perhaps a little maturity and faith to become a little bit more aware of. There's a difference between just having human compassion on people, which is a wonderful thing. God put that into our heart. But there's a difference between that and divine compassion. So we have to be careful, or not so much careful, but maybe become aware that there is a compassion higher than our own human compassion that we're looking for. And when we find this compassion, the divine compassion makes us less significant, whereas human compassion tends to make us more significant. At least that's how I would define it, if that's even a definition. But that's how I would differentiate between the two. Does that ring true to you too, as well, as you're thinking about it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm reading another passage from 149 that I had highlighted. One who gives in the right way shuts his eyes, then you do not see the gift, small it is, before you plainly see what God made it into. And once again, you confess that you are more insignificant than the gift, which is always the case with the giver when he gives a good gift or does his part so that it can become that.
Okay.
I think that's a really, I hope that's addressing the distinction you made between divine compassion and human compassion, that from what I understand, if the gift is given with the right reference in mind, it doesn't inflate the sense of self of the individual.
Right. It doesn't elevate us above the other person. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So he kind of nails it right there. On page 151, I have another quotation here. If he otherwise was more concerned for the welfare than itching for, oh, I'm sorry. I started one. Once it's a little too soon there. Okay. Therefore, if you have any truth to offer mankind, reduce the impact of yourself. Nullify yourself. Sacrifice yourself when offering your gift, lest people take you instead of the gift, lest their lives be ruined in an illusion by possessing truth without, however, possessing it. So he's encouraging us to play less of a role in the gift giving, because otherwise the person is going to value us and is going to take their mind off the gift and create an obligation on behalf of the other person who sets us too high. Placing ourselves in the limelight is just as bad as placing someone above Jesus in a sense. We need to point their gratitude towards God and not take credit lest we find ourselves competing for God's glory. And many people, it's hard to resist. It really is hard to resist when somebody's trying to tell you, oh, you're such a wonderful person that you've given this to me. Boy, you are the greatest Christian. It's kind of hard not to say, well, yeah, you got a good point. Yeah, you want to kind of take the credit, but you can't. You got to let it go. I've seen this a lot in personal testimonies. I was involved in some churches where personal testimony is really almost the mainstay of the church. Everybody gets up and gives a personal testimony, how you found God, the good things you've done today. And these personal testimonies are not to bring glory to us by showing how God values our faith or our good works, but they ought to be told, these stories, and it's okay to tell stories of personal testimonies, but they must be told to eventually bring glory to God alone. This has to be even true of the hymns that we sing. We need to sing hymns that bring glory to God, not increase our fame or our pocketbook as some so-called Christian ministries. We have to make sure that God is always the one being glorified, never us as individuals or even as groups. Okay, now he's kind of getting close here to the end here. He now talks about the giver, that we must take care in accepting the gratitude of another. If we say that it was nothing or it wasn't important, we diminish the importance and the value of the need. It might be more appropriate to say, I'm glad that God was able to give me the opportunity to help you. So when people give us a gift, sometimes, and it may be in good conscience, trying to be humble, we say, oh, no, it's okay. It was nothing. But what a message we're sending is that this is unimportant. Your needs are kind of unimportant. Instead of phrasing it that way, to phrase it to say that I'm glad that God was able to use me to give you something of value. Therefore, we don't diminish their need as though, oh, it's nothing. Your needs are nothing to me. But rather, it brings the gift to a higher level again than the giver, as well as the receiver. And he talks about intellectual gifts. There are gifts that one might give, such as knowledge. As a teacher, you give knowledge as a gift, and it really is a gift to give knowledge. If the teacher really loves his students, he would give the gift for the purpose of upbuilding the student rather than simply demonstrating his own skill and intellect for the purpose of creating another understudy. So maybe some teachers teach with the idea that I'm going to be a great teacher and all my students are just merely understudies to me, but rather to teach with the hope that these people are going to rise up even to be better teachers than yourself. You're planting seeds, and your expectation is that these seeds can grow up to be even greater than yourself. That would be the right way, in Kierkegaard's eyes, to give the gift of knowledge. Because knowledge is only temporary. It's a temporary gift which also can be taken back at any time.
Oh, yes.
And then now this is really, really clever of him here. He talks about an old proverb that we've all heard. It's better to give than to receive, right? I think everybody has heard that. And he says, is this really always the case? It's also, he says, true that it's greater to receive than to give. So he kind of turns the Proverbs on its head. If the one giving the gift realizes that he's less significant than the gift, he gives correctly. And if the one who receives the gift receives it realizing he is less significant than the gift, then he receives it correctly. So equality has been completed. The gift itself belongs to neither because the gift is from above. So here he's tying it right back into that Bible verse again, that the gift is perfect from above. If the giver gives it believing the gift is greater than himself and from above, and the receiver accepts it in that same frame of reference, then everything is equalized. Everything is done the way God wants it to be done. And finally, he brings love into this. He says love is the only perfect gift because it's both given and received in the correct way, in that same way, where love is higher than both the giver and the receiver. The integrity of the gift is now complete. What we're doing by giving a gift is extending God's love to one another. The gift belongs to God, and the giver and the receiver are now inseparable. So we see this in God as well. God, in the gospel, we're taught in Philippians that God humbles himself in order to give the gift of salvation. And man must humble himself to receive it. So the gift of salvation is the perfect gift from above because both the giver and the receiver value the gift higher than themselves. Even God values the gift higher than himself in that sense, if he could. But that's why he takes upon himself the form of a man. He humbles himself because the gift is far too important for God to be saying, hey, I'm God. I don't need to do that. He doesn't. He says, I'm God. I need to do that. So it puts the whole perspective of salvation in a little bit of a different level. And this, again, brings us back to James. All generous giving and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or the slightest hint of change. So he brings us full circle back to that verse. And that's it. I can't say any more than that. End on a high